So many of you have seen this, and I always like to have anecdotal information, as you know. So my thinking really is that as scientists, we are always learning that, for example, our subject matter, in this case, our athletes, they are always 10 million steps ahead of us, and we are always catching up, trying to fill in the gaps with some proper evidence. And so there's some quotes here from Nolan Hoffman. He's a South African cyclist. He says he tries to sleep 8 to 10 hours per night. Usain Bolt refers to the importance of sleep for his adaptation and recovery from training. Maria Sharapova refers to sleep as her hobby. I can definitely relate to that. And Phelps says that it's not just the quantity, but the quality of sleep that matters. And so, in fact, many teams now actually use sleep coaches as part of their sort of entourage to try to get that little bit of extra sort of 0.5% out of performance of their athletes. And so our job as the researchers is to try to understand exactly why it is that athletes know so intuitively that sleep is critical for them from a performance perspective. So if we take a step back, we all know now that sleep is essential for the brain and for the body. In fact, there's animal studies that have shown that with complete sleep deprivation, the only outcome is death. So it takes somewhere between sort of 5 and 30 days. And then unfortunately, the animals in that experiment, they don't make it. So more tricky to do that in humans. So there are no human models. More tricky, it's absolutely impossible. Never going to get ethics for that. And so, but I mean, we assume it's something similar, but just as a little fun fact, and I guess out of interest, the human record for going without sleep stands at 18 days, 21 hours and 40 minutes. So this was obviously self-inflicted, and this is the gentleman now, but he set this record in 1986 as a teenager. And that is what currently stands in the Guinness Book of World Records, but they have stopped monitoring and looking for complete sleep deprivation. What is the word I'm looking for now? For the person who can do it the most, you know what I mean. There we go, records.
Were there side effects to him doing that?
He's dead. Not long term, no.
Blindness, temporary blindness?
No. So the kinds of things that people who do have, because a number of people have done this, the biggest things that happen are sort of starting to imagine things. So hallucination, thank you very much. Told you I do not work in 5 hours of sleep. So hallucination, massive inability to regulate mood and control emotions, paranoia. So a lot of psychological changes. I mean, obviously the person feels tired and lethargic, and coordination disappears almost entirely. So become very, very uncoordinated and incoherent and that kind of thing. So these are all like major brain effects, but over just a relatively short time. I mean, to be honest, no one measured biologically what was happening. It wasn't conducted as an experiment. This was somebody doing that. So I would put my money on the fact that there were changes to the cardiovascular system and to metabolism, because we know that that's what happens with sleep deprivation, but it wasn't actually measured. Anyhow, the reason that these have been stopped, of course, is because of the inherent dangers associated with chronic sleep deprivation. So no one's allowed to go and try for that world record, so he'll have that forever and ever. But complete sleep deprivation is not something that we typically do. So we know that you might pull the odd all-nighter every now and then when you need to get something done, but even across the lifespan, it's not particularly common for people to really go around not sleeping entirely. What we normally do is either a night or two of no sleep, if that's sort of the all-nighter. Think about people on shift work, they often have to experience that. But more to the point, what we usually do is something that we call partial sleep restriction. And that's just not quite getting enough on a regular basis. And we know that there is oodles of evidence which suggests that when we are partially sleep restricted, this impairs both physical and mental health. And not going into the details of it, but we know that we see effects almost immediately in terms of cognition, learning and memory consolidation, mood and mental well-being, growth and repair of cells. And now we're starting to think about the athletic setting, metabolism, and also immune response. And so the key things that happen when we sleep, which lead to these deficits when we are sleep deprived, there's sort of three main things that I want, or 3 or 4 things I want to just touch on for athletes. The first is that one of the things that happens is that we enhance our neural connections or neural pathways during sleep. So this is hugely important for plasticity of the brain. And so that means that if we are embedding down a new skill, for example, as an athlete, then the neural pathways that we made use of in order to conduct that particular skill or movement pattern, for example, that gets embedded or entrenched while we sleep. So that's a good thing. Sleep is super important, as you, I think I've mentioned this to everybody before, but there's a big housekeeping function when we sleep, that we remove toxins from the brain, and it's really metabolic byproducts that are building up quite naturally as a consequence of metabolism. But obviously with extended wakefulness, then those levels can become suboptimal. And when we sleep, the lymphatic system is responsible for removing these. And so, for example, there's been a heap of interest in something called beta amyloid recently, because we can see that in people who develop early onset neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's, they have higher than normal levels of beta amyloid. And the studies have shown quite nicely with fMRI is that when we sleep, we actually are removing beta amyloid. So it's kind of that insurance policy for the future, in my mind, to help push out or delay the inevitable neurodegeneration that we see with aging. So that's a really important function for sleep. And then the other super important thing relates to immunity, and this one is also critical for athletes. So again, I've probably spoken about this before with most of you, but just in case that it's new, essentially, if I very crudely divide your immune system into 2 components, I think about the innate and the adaptive components. The innate immune system is primarily active while we're awake, and that's defending us against, for example, inhaled, absorbed or ingested pathogens. That makes sense because we're all busy sharing germs right now, so we want our first line of defense to be super robust. But when we sleep, then our adaptive immunity becomes more active, and that's the part of your immune system that on one hand trawls your body looking for damaged mutated cells, so it gets and it destroys them, which is super important from an anti-cancer perspective. But also that part of your immune system then is busy building the antibodies that you need to defend you against the viruses that you're exposed to. So by any stretch, if you are shortchanging yourself on sleep, you are really doing a disservice to your immune system by giving it a shortened period of time in which to do these supercritical tasks. And so any of us that have been sleep deprived for a couple of days, you'll notice that you'll, for example, start to get a little bit of a sore throat and you're, oh no, I'm going down. And that's true. That is you sort of about to, your body basically battling to keep you healthy. And so you need to then put some sleep in place to sort that out. So as a summary then, and this is well established, I'm not going to go through to this in any more detail, but from an athlete's perspective, we can appreciate that sleep is absolutely critical from an immunity perspective. Nothing worse than an athlete training for a big event. And perhaps I'm thinking about an Olympic Games or something like that. You've been waiting sometimes up to 7 or 8 years to get to that event. And the last thing that you need is to then turn up in a few days before and not be able to compete due to illness. And so from an immunity perspective, sleep's critical for athletes for obvious reasons. It's important from a motor learning perspective, of course. So that's that neuroplasticity that I spoke to. When we sleep, we do a huge amount of our physical repair and recovery. So we secrete large amounts of growth hormone and testosterone, and that's critical for muscle adaptation, which is obviously key. And we replenish our energy stores as well. But I think the way we need to think about sleep in terms of athletes is like, what is the relationship between training and sleep, competition and sleep, actual performance, psychological well-being, and then of course, even injury. And all of these things have actually a bi-directional relationship with sleep, because if I think about training, for example, we know that we need to sleep in order to support the adaptation to training, but also in periods of very high training, we are very likely to have more disturbed sleep. And in fact, in periods of overtraining, sleep goes often very much out the window. When we think about competition, there's heaps of previously anecdotal evidence and now actually measured evidence to show that the night before a competition, people often have very poor sleep. Partly it's because they are worried or stressed or anxious about the actual performance. Sometimes it's related to the fact that you need to get up early to make sure that you make the start on time, and then you're stressed that you might miss your alarm, for example. And then there's more recent evidence which also shows that sleep on the night after a match or competition is often also quite impaired. And that's related to a number of factors. For example, you've still got high levels of cortisol or adrenaline related to performing. Sometimes athletes then ruminate over the outcome, be it positive or negative. And sometimes, depending on the nature of the sport, athletes have ingested huge amounts of caffeine, higher than what they would normally do. And that's got incredibly destructive consequences on their sleep as well. So we know that very often the night after competition, sleep is quite poor. And then from a performance perspective, I'm going to just summarize some of what we do know. So we'll look at that in a second. From a psychological well-being perspective, just like with the average Joe, most of us that are sitting here, sleep and mental health are inextricably linked. And athletes, of course, are not immune from that relationship. And so while there are aspects of stress and anxiety, for example, that impair sleep. So in the average population, when we take away sleep disorders or any other explanations, or medical conditions that might explain poor sleep, stress and anxiety is the #1 ruiner of sleep. And I'm sure that everybody here can identify with that. You've got a lot on your mind and you haven't dealt with things, and you think you're okay, you go to sleep, and lo and behold, somewhere between 1 and 3 in the morning, your brain just goes, and then it starts to worry and ruminate and stress. And the world is definitely going to end at 2 o'clock in the morning. Nothing is solvable. Everything is a train smash. And then you wake up the next morning, rubbish, because now your sleep has been rudely interrupted. I can't believe I was that stressed about that particular thing. But anyway, that's pretty much the reason for that, is that when we sleep, our brain is, one of the things that it does is it busy sorts through a whole lot of stuff, okay? And things that you haven't actively dealt with in the daytime often then come through in the night, and they're now basically asking for airtime. And so athletes are not immune from that, and managing their levels of stress and anxiety is absolutely critical for their sleep. And then, of course, we know that the risks for, like, for example, if you have depression or generalized anxiety disorder, you will also very likely have pretty often quite disrupted sleep. And then the medications that are used to treat those things also impair sleep. So, but that's really how we deal with addressing mental health and sleep in athletes is really quite similar to what we would do for the general population. And then lastly, there's some evidence now which is suggesting that over time, insufficient sleep might increase risk of injury amongst athletes, and then vice versa. Once an athlete has an injury related to pain, for example, then sleep, of course, can also be impaired. So this is just a little summary of some of the injury studies. I'm going to just put a little disclaimer up here right now. I unashamedly used a heap of Jan Lemuur's little infographics, because he does such a great job of sometimes summarizing some of the work in much nicer style that I can ever possibly do. So thank you very much, Jan Lemuur. So here's a little review that he's put together, well, a little overview of 5 different studies that have looked at young athletes and associations or relationships between sleep and injury. And in all of those studies, except for one, they showed that the athletes who are on the shorter side of sleep amongst their peers had higher risk generally of being injured. And some of those studies were prospective and some were cross-sectional. But there is some variability in the studies, but there's certainly some evidence suggesting that there is an association. So you will have seen these sleep duration guidelines before. And we know that for like teens, for example, 14 to 17-year-olds and young adults, 18 to 25, I'm really staying it there for the moment just because that's where most young athletes are. Of course, some of us are master athletes, Malcolm. But typically then sleep needs for the general population are sort of somewhere between 8 and 10 hours for adolescents and 7 to 9 hours for us older athletes. I mean, older people, sorry, not athletes. But what you can see is the little turquoise bit on either side, which is the the may be okay zones. So for some people, 6 hours is sufficient and others 10 is necessary. But really what I'm trying to just quickly show here is that, yes, on average, maybe 8 hours is the optimal sleep duration for the average person to promote optimal physical and mental health. But I can guarantee you that the athletes should be on the upper side of that. And I can further guarantee you that most athletes are nowhere near that. And so these guidelines do need to be considered slightly differently for athletes. So how much do athletes think that they actually need to sleep? So this was a study done by a very active group of sleep researchers in Australia. They're generating more of the sleep data related to athletes than anyone else in the world. They had a look at 175 elite athletes, quite young, 22, from various different individual and team sports. They did a questionnaire with them to say, like, how much do you think you really need to feel well rested? Then they kept a diary for a week, and then they also measured their sleep properly with actigraphy to get an idea of what was going on. And what they observed very briefly is that although there was a range in what the athletes felt that they needed, somewhere between sort of 6 and 9 hours, and that's what I would think is an expected range. When you actually measure them without fail, none of them were getting anything close to that. And in fact, yeah, I think that only 3% of them were actually getting as much, were physically getting the sleep that they thought that they needed. So they were thinking that they needed closer to 8 hours, and they were getting just under 6 on average, just under 6.7 hours. And 71% of these athletes fell short of their, this is what I need, by a good hour. So this here had a look a little bit more closely at some of what sleep in athletes looks like. This was based on a systematic review from 81 studies, looking at data from 1,800 athletes and over 18 or nearly 19,000 nights of sleep. What they observed on average is that these athletes' total sleep time is 7.2 hours. So we're on the short side of that 7 to 9 hour range. Their sleep efficiency on average was 86%. So sleep efficiency is a measure of when you're in bed trying to sleep, how much sleep are you actually getting? It's a super important measure in terms of quality of sleep. And most people should be 80 to 90% efficient. 85 is the cut point for sleep maintenance type insomnia, by the way. And so these athletes, from an efficiency perspective, although they're in the normal zone, they're only in that normal zone by about 1% on average. Interestingly, they spend about the right time in their deep sleep. That's non-REM stage 3. They're there for around 20% of the time, 19%. And we like to see people doing around 20%. So that's normal for the general population. As I'm going to show you just now, it possibly could be a little bit less than what is needed for an athletic population. And they spend approximately the right amount of time in REM or rapid eye movement sleep. It should be about a quarter of the night, and they're there for 25% of the time. So what they did observe, however, is that in the younger athletes, their sleep was even shorter and of even poorer efficiency. And that was primarily coming from more disturbed sleep, especially during heavy periods of training compared to preseason and in-season training periods. So that's obviously somewhat concerning. And then this survey also looked at sleep amongst highly trained rugby sevens, rugby union, and cricket athletes in Australia. And they saw that they were reporting around almost 8 hours of sleep per night, but 50% of them were found to have poor sleep quality. So that's a super high value, higher than what we would see in the general population. 38% of them just defined themselves as snorers, and 8% had what we would call a witnessed apneic event. So you might think, okay, why would we be worried about snoring in athletes? Well, in anybody really. So if people are excessive snorers, 2 concerns. The snoring actually keeps bouncing you out of your deep sleep. So it often fragments your sleep more than you would like. Obviously, it irritates the person next to you. So now that relationship is not so great either. But it's also a risk factor for obstructive sleep apnea. And although this is often associated with obesity, for example, it's a sleep-related breathing disorder that is not uncommon in strength and power athletes. And so very often rugby players, for example, are at a higher risk for this sleep disorder, which is often not even considered as being a problem, but it's got massive effects on the person's quality of sleep and on their cardiovascular health. So that's quite important. And 28% of the athletes reported what we would call clinically significant daytime sleepiness. And if we see those levels in the average population, we would want to do something, because at the end of the day, sleep, its whole job is to make sure that we function well during the daytime. And having such high levels of sleepiness is obviously quite concerning. So what factors might be contributing to sleep disturbance in athletes? So it's been summarized in a recent consensus statement by Walsh and his colleagues here in terms of being sporting factors and non-sporting factors. So from a sporting perspective, high training loads is known to disturb sleep, as I've already mentioned. Sleeping in an unfamiliar environment when athletes need to travel can be quite disconcerting for some. Early morning training is a recent thing that's coming to the fore, and that is being shown to be pretty damaging to sleep, especially in younger athletes. So we know that younger athletes tend to be more night owl oriented. And so they have later sleep timing, and having super early morning training sessions for them has the only undesired consequence of reducing their nocturnal sleep opportunity. So very often young athletes very much are sleep deprived thanks to early morning training sessions. And as I've mentioned, the night before a competition, you can have pretty poor sleep. We've got jet lag, so long haul travel, specifically transmeridian travel, obviously is a factor if you're part of a traveling sports team, because of the jet lag and the circadian disruption that happens with that. And then nighttime competition as well. So competing at nighttime leaves you incredibly hyper aroused at the end of the day when you're trying to come down. And the studies that have been done there have shown that after competition at night, athletes will go to bed later because they obviously can't fall asleep, and they will generally have more disturbed sleep and shorter sleep as well. And then the non-sporting factors are those which are, none of us are immune to those, but they're equally as important amongst athletes, ranging from social demands and needs. So the good old screens, we're seeing a huge amount of screen time issues amongst younger individuals, but especially this is hectic for athletes because of the effects that it's going to have on an already shortened sleep opportunity. And the very last thing that we need to be doing is shortening that sleep opportunity anymore. And then a range of other factors around work and study commitments, family commitments, differences between individuals, various lifestyle choices, for example, caffeine use and diet, and then attitudes and beliefs around sleep as well, and expectations of that. So these are all factors. So when we think about the consequences of deprivation or restriction on sleep, we can think about, remember, deprivation is completely not going to sleep, so zero sleep in a 24-hour period, whereas sleep restriction would be just a reduced sleep opportunity in that period. So from a deprivation perspective, it's just to very, very briefly summarize the research, no surprise that it's detrimental to physical performance. I don't think anybody would have guessed that it would be any different to that. But the question is that actually even relevant to elite athletes? Because how often are elite athletes going to go around pulling all-nighters, for example, when they're supposed to be in a competition phase, for example? So it's more likely that they'll experience that in travel, which then gets planned for in terms of recovery. But sleep restriction is definitely something that is much more interesting and probably more applicable. The thing is, the research around the effects of sleep restriction on physical performance are actually quite mixed, and there are probably a number of reasons for that. So this systematic review and meta-analysis had a look at the effects of acute sleep loss on physical performance. And of all the studies that they reviewed, they divide them into categories where they looked at, okay, what is normal sleep? So that's the top little bar. What happens when we do what's called early sleep restriction? So that means really we're delaying bedtime. Okay, so that's probably what heaps of young athletes do. What about late restriction? So late restriction is where we go to bed normally, but we wake up super early, like this morning. Okay, feeling that one. Fragmented sleep is when you have broken sleep, so like you would experience with sleep maintenance type insomnia, and then there's complete sleep deprivation as well. So in this particular review, they included 69 studies with 227 outcomes in the analysis. And overall, they showed that whether you're speaking about deprivation or restriction, the average impact on sports performance is a reduction of around 7.6% in terms of performance. Yeah, but what's really interesting to me is that they then looked at the studies that had measured specifically anaerobic power, speed, power, endurance, high intensity interval exercise, strength, endurance, and skill. And you can see that the things that get more affected hugely are skills related performance. And that makes sense given the importance of sleep for neuroplasticity. So that results in a reduction of almost 20% of performance. Strength endurance has quite a big impact as well at almost 10%. Endurance somewhere around 5.6%. But the other thing to look at some of the differences between deprivation and complete restriction. So you would expect complete restriction to have bigger impacts than deprivation. And to some extent, it mostly does, but sometimes it doesn't. And sometimes the deprivation effects are actually non-significant. So even though they're showing like a reduction, they weren't actually significant. And so the reasons for that relate to when you when you restrict a person, it depends when you are restricting them. So patterns of sleep loss, so depending on whether you're doing deprivation or early or late restriction, which precede exercise, is a very important factor to consider in terms of performance changes. And so consistent negative effects are observed on performance when we're looking at complete deprivation or late restriction protocols. That's when the person wakes up very early for training. And time awake prior to a task seems to be important. And they, on average, showed that for every hour that you're awake prior to exercise, you can look at about a 0.4% reduction in physical performance. And then also time of day at which you conduct the tasks is very important. So studies that have measured performance in the evening consistently show negative effect, while the morning tasks are largely unaffected, and that's probably related to time from your last sleep. So this explains why Celine's study looks so dodgy. Right. And then in terms of what about if we improve sleep, can we lengthen sleep in athletes to have some kind of an impact? And so we need to consider both acute and chronic sleep improvement. So acute sleep improvement, there is some murky, but perhaps intriguing preliminary data to show that sleep extension can improve sport-specific skill execution. But the studies unfortunately often lack objective measures of sleep for a control group. So for example, Ma et al. In really 2011 did a study which looked at sleep extension in basketball players. So you'll notice, honest students, there's a very, very small sample size, 11. This can only be considered to be a pilot study, and we must be super careful with looking at and interpreting the data here. They measured in the individual's sleep in the 2 to 4 weeks prior and saw that they slept in that range of 6 to 9 hours. And then they said, cool, for the next 5 to 7 weeks, extend your sleep to 10 hours. That's a big ask. And let me tell you, if you don't have a high sleep need, there is no ways you can extend your sleep by that much, because your body will revolt and give you very poor sleep quality. They managed to, on average, increase their sleep by nearly 2 hours. So that actually tells me that their underlying sleep that they were doing was probably insufficient. And then associated with that increased sleep duration, they then observed faster sprinting time, improved shooting accuracy, improved reaction time, which is what you would expect, less daytime sleepiness, not surprising, and improved ratings of physical and mental well-being. The major problem with that study is they didn't have a control group, but it's some interesting preliminary data to suggest that you can increase sleep in athletes and have some positive consequences. And then similarly, this study looked at sleep extension on serving accuracy of college tennis players. I don't know who invents these studies, but anyway. So again, tiny sample size of 12, absolutely must be taken with the world's largest pinch of salt. But what they did is they looked at habitual sleep wake schedules for 1 week prior. They called that their baseline sleep, and they asked them to aim for more than 9 hours for the second part of the study. And they found that the participants extended their sleep significantly by almost an hour and 50 minutes or so. Again, you can't extend sleep and if you don't actually have a need for it, because you'll just create insomnia. Tennis serve accuracy improved from 35% to 41%, and their daytime sleepiness went down from a scale of 12, which is considered to be excessive daytime sleepiness. 10 is a clinical cutoff, by the way, all the way down to 5. So they definitely are finding that these athletes are probably a bit underslept, and that therefore it's not too surprising to see skill-based activities improve. However, when you look at sort of the sleep hygiene strategies that people often say to people. And again, we're not fans of the word sleep hygiene, but it's asking people to do the really obvious things correctly, like try and sleep in an environment that is coolish, try and sleep in an environment that is darkish, try to limit tech before sleep and be careful of having a very noisy environment if you're sensitive to noise. All of these things have shown that in athletes, we can actually improve their sleep duration over the short term, but that there's very limited evidence that it actually has any impact on actual performance. Rather, chronic sleep improvement strategies seem to have a bigger impact on sports performance in athletes. So what I've shown you, it basically is that there's evidence that performance is associated with sleep restriction or sleep deprivation, but that's looking at it from the fact if I have poor sleep and then I try and perform, what actually happens. But what I really like about this study here, and this was going back way in time, this was from 1966, is that this group here were not exercise physiologists. They were actually just very interested in sleep. And they asked themselves the question, because there was an implication that delta sleep, so that's what we used to call slow wave or deep sleep, might be related to energy expenditure. And in turn, the amount of physical activity indulged during wakefulness. Don't you love that term? They wondered if people who were more active would show more deep sleep, for example. And so this was at a time when the scientists in the sleep field had just learned to measure sleep using a technique called polysomnography. So they were very, very interested in what was happening in the brain. That allowed us to do sleep staging, for example. So you'll see they were super focused on that. And so this again is for the especially for the honor students. This is what they wrote in their methods, that the present experiment was primarily designed to test the hypothesis that sleep on nights following days associated with strenuous exercise would have a greater proportion of delta sleep than on nights associated with days without such exercise. Good hypothesis, huh? Cool. So what did they show from their PSG data? That following a training session that had taken place in the afternoon, that night, the participants in the first 6 hours of sleep demonstrated around 40% of slow wave or deep sleep. Following training sessions that had taken place in the evening, it was around 35%. And then on a rest day, their slow wave sleep was reduced to around 32%. So that was some preliminary evidence to show that if you had been training in a daytime, you did more deep sleep at nighttime. Noticing that in non-athletes and sedentary individuals at the time, sort of delta or slow wave sleep should have been around 20%, which is similar to what we see now. The other thing to notice is that even on their rest day, they're doing more slow wave sleep than the average person, which probably speaks to the fact that they are always doing a fair amount of recovery. And so they concluded that in addition to the fact that if you trained, you were going to do more slow wave sleep, that the evening exercise produces a more disturbed sleep. And they noticed this because they saw more periods of wakefulness, and suggesting that exercise is a stressor, which produces CNS activation, opposing a more general effective exercise tending to increase delta sleep requirements. And so this was really interesting because it was conducted such a long time ago and then really completely ignored. And it says to me two things. It says, one, sleep must surely then be so important for recovery. And nobody looked at that. Everyone kept doing, let's deprive people and then exercise them, which is really not, it's going about things backwards. And it was some of the very first evidence to suggest that exercise can actually be, can break sleep as well through perhaps CNS activation. And so 16 years ago, Charles Samuels from Canada already said that sleep recovery and performance is the new frontier in high performance athletics. And this is where the key recovery comes into. And this is what I think needed to be focused on. And so we had a look at this some years ago now, looking at the effects of sleep deprivation. Does it affect recovery from training? Because at the time, no one had actually done that study. We got pipped to the post while we were busy writing up, someone else actually did it. Damn it. And they published just before us, but theirs was different because they looked at recovery from they looked at recovery from a match. They looked at recovery from training. So they're complementary. We work together. But what we did is we looked at trained cyclists who did a high intensity interval training session, and then after that training session, we gave them either normal sleep, or in a crossover study, they came back and they repeated, and then we gave them half of their normal sleep, and we measured recovery in their performance. And following partial sleep deprivation, they were clearly more sleepy. They didn't feel like training the next day. They also had blunted training-induced reductions in blood pressure, by the by. But most importantly, if you'd had your full night of sleep, you were 99% recovered the next day in terms of performance. And if you were partially sleep deprived, you were only 95% recovered. And so it was some of the first evidence to suggest that actually sleep is so important for recovery. And so this is a little know about the food pyramid, and now they've base part of this pyramid, because of the evidence which is now building up to show that sleep is so important for recovery. And primarily this relates probably to our physical repair and recovery. And so this particular study had a quick look at what happens to testosterone secretion during the night when you have had either short or fragmented sleep. And so it was a small study, also only with 10 participants, and they experienced partial sleep deprivation and fragmented sleep, so in a 24-hour period. And then they measured testosterone through the night, and they observed that in the continuous sleep, that testosterone onset, which is that sort of diurnal increase, was at around 10:30 at night, and it was super delayed to around 3 in the morning in the fragmented sleep. And also, although there was this nocturnal rise in testosterone in all of the continuous or healthy sleepers, when you had fragmented sleep, 60% of them didn't exhibit any increase in testosterone. So you can imagine the consequences on recovery for that. And so current recommendations around sleep are that we should be educating athletes. Of course, that makes sense. We need to screen and refer if we're concerned about sleep disorders or other physical or mental health disorders which are impacting sleep. The recommendation is for them to include naps, which I hate, but anyway, this seems to be the way forward now. But I will chat about that on another day. And then the other thing is around banking sleep as well, which I'm going to quickly chat about. But probably one of the most interesting bits of information that's coming out now suggests that we really need to consider when they're training. And I'm not just saying wearing my circadian hat and saying, oh, because we've got evidence to show that night owls do better training in the evening and morning people do better training in the morning. But in terms of the relationship between like sleep and training, and student athletes in the UK, there's 157 of them standard, half of them are poor sleep, quarter of them are reporting less than 7 hours sleep. They're doing catch-up sleep on the weekend, by the way, which means that their week sleep is insufficient. And what they observed is that early morning sport frequency was associated with worse sleep quality and sleep health, earlier weekday wake-up times, and shorter sleep durations. And those are in adjusted hierarchical regression models. And when they looked at similar relationships for late evening sport frequency and also academic related and sport related time demands, none of those significantly predicted any of the sleep parameters. So it was that morning training session that seems to be sessions that is problematic. And so they suggest that adjusting sports scheduling to avoid early morning start times could provide a means to improve sleep outcomes and possibly performance in young athletes. And so then the question is, can we store sleep? And this experiment said, well, if you bank sleep, you can mitigate against the sleep deprivation related decrements in performance. So in the first situation, they had a week of normal sleep, around 8 hours 15 per night. In scenario 2, they did 6 nights of extended sleep where they were aiming for 10 hours and they got 9 hours 50. Then they did a night of total sleep deprivation, and then they gave them a performance task. It was an isometric knee extension test until exhaustion. Not my most favorite type of exercise for measuring performance, but I suppose it's laboratory controlled. And what they observed is that when you'd had your normal night of sleep, then you were sleep deprived, and then you did the task, had a 7% reduction in performance. So that's in line with what we saw earlier. But when you bank sleep ahead, and then you have the night of total sleep deprivation, your performance is only reduced by 3.7%. So there's a little bit of a protective effect there, which is kind of cool. Okay, so I'm not the world's biggest fan of napping. I'm not sure that we're supposed to be napping, but I'll definitely give in a little bit, but only a little bit, and say that athletes typically do get a nap license. So the reason I'm not a massive fan of napping is that sometimes people use napping as a band-aid solution to fix very broken nocturnal sleep. Okay, so my feeling is that if your nocturnal sleep is intact and you still have a higher sleep need as athletes do, then you're allowed to nap. And in fact, there's now quite a lot of evidence, unfortunately, which is showing that amongst athletes who do nap, and we know that this is probably because they're chronically sleep deprived, cognitive performance is improved, physical performance, there's a large effect on that, and perception of fatigue as well. So we can put napping into place. And then the last thing I just want to quickly finish on is around caffeine, because caffeine is a huge factor specifically for endurance sports. And I often hear athletes say, you know, I actually really struggle in competition because now I'm, especially multi-day events where we're having huge amounts of caffeine, much more than what you would usually do, and what's the impact on sleep. And so the Ascension, this year had a look at a whole lot of studies which are controlled crossover design studies. So it looked at data from 24 different studies, which had as an intervention versus a placebo or abstinence, I should rather say, caffeine use as an acute daily dose. And then they, just to say that they did use normal habitual users of caffeine. So people who would normally have 1 to 3 cups per day, which I think is very important because that's probably the average population of caffeine users. And then they sometimes in most of the studies, they just looked at what are the effects of sleep with just 1 day of between 1 and 3 cups of coffee. And then a couple of the studies actually extended it to 4, 6, 9, and 14 days. There we go. But on average, what they found is that, as we understand, caffeine reduces total sleep time by reducing sleep efficiency, and it creates more arousals or awakenings in sleep. And so there's more wake onset time, a little bit of a longer time to fall asleep, a little bit more time spent in light sleep, and less time spent in deep sleep. And that's because of those constant arousals. So they're not massive differences, but it's enough for us to feel sometimes that sleep's not quite as restorative as we wish. And so the use of caffeine in athletes needs to be, I think, done really carefully. I would imagine that in training periods, you want to probably quite carefully limit so that you maximize recovery. And then knowing that when you get to events, you'll probably will have higher caffeine usage, but be aware of the consequences that is going to have on your sleep. Because even if you think you're a person that can have a double espresso and go straight to sleep, you probably can, but I guarantee you it will be changing the structure of your sleep. And so really just to end, the one thing that we're learning in sleep research is that sleep is it's multidimensional. We cannot just think about sleep in terms of duration. And in fact, we know this from when we try and analyze our sleep data, because we seem to have 10,000 variables. And we always think, which ones are the important ones in trying to understand sleep? And I kind of think about it a little bit like the sort of the story about, you know, the men all touching on the different part of the elephant. And then, you know, if you think that if you've got the tail, then you're going to describe the creature as something that feels like a rope, for example. And it's very much like that with sleep. You know, if you can measure polysomnography, you're going to be obsessed with sleep staging. If you can measure actigraphy, you'll be obsessed with maybe sleep regularity, for example. If you've got a diary or self-report, you might just be considering sleep duration. But I think you probably need to put it all together to really see what's happening. And we need to take that through to athletes as well, because the sleep health dimensions all fit together somehow. And we can't consider just duration on its own. We need to consider all of these other components. How regular is my sleep? How continuous or efficient is it? When is it timed? That's important. How alert or sleepy are we in the daytime? And then how satisfied are individuals? And so it was kind of funny that this week this came across my desk. It was a call from Nature and Science of Sleep on a special collection for Dreaming of Victory. It's called The Influence of Sleep on Athletic Performance. So they say that the intricate relationship between sleep and athletic performance is an emerging field of interest. And this collection is seeking to explore and deepen our understanding of how sleep impacts the physical and mental capabilities of athletes. And they're looking at the dynamic interplay between sleep patterns. And I like that because it means that it's this multidimensional aspect of sleep and athletic performance. And they're saying that recently sleep is now viewed as a cornerstone of athletic recovery and performance. And there's a pressing need for evidence-based interventions and strategies for athletes to try to manage their performance. And so there's a call for us to now put together studies and to really start to look at this in the sports science field.